Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Paralyzed Veterans of America ADA webinar. We'll be starting in just a few minutes, allowing other people to get into the room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Paralyzed Veterans of America 2022 Americans with Disabilities Act webinar. My name is Danica Gonzalez, and I'm the advocacy attorney at Paralyzed Veterans of America. This webinar is put on in celebration of the 32nd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. We appreciate that you can join us today. The presentation will focus on vacationing in the ADA, increasing access for wheelchair users. Next slide. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on our website, pva.org. Closed captioning is available. Click the CC button in the meetings controls bar at the bottom of your screen to turn it on. If you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A box. That will be the Q&A box, not the chat box, which is enabled, but please put all questions in the Q&A box. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Next slide. Today, we'll be discussing different aspects of vacationing, including accessing public transportation, hotels, restaurants, ballparks, and sports stadiums, and what the ADA requires. The presenters today will be Lee Page, Senior Associate Advocacy Director, who will be discussing public transportation. Myself, Danica Gonzalez, Advocacy Attorney, and I will be covering hotels and restaurants. And Susan Prokop, National Advocacy Director, who will talk about the requirements for sports stadiums and ballparks. Heather Ainsley, Associate Executive Director of Government Relations, will moderate the questions and answers portion at the end of the presentation. Next slide. For some background, the ADA was passed on July 26, 1990. The ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life. The ADA is divided into 5 titles or sections that relate to different areas. Sections cover employment, state and local governments, public accommodations, and telecommunications. This presentation will cover how the ADA protects individuals with disabilities and the requirements under Title II and Title III of the ADA during vacations. I will now turn it over to Lee Page to discuss public transportation under Title II.
Okay, thanks, Danica. Can everybody see me and hear me? Next slide. We're talking about transit stations or public transit stations on my presentation. I will be talking about accessible parking at train stations, the required number of spaces, accessible route or path of travel, and then actually getting on your train of choice, whether it's subway, commuter rail, or Amtrak, heavy rail. Next slide. So accessible parking at train stations. Transit stations are designed basically as multimodal hubs for light and heavy rail mixed with city and long distance bus services. Most transit stations have a drop-off lane, daily parking, and adjacent some sort of long-term parking or parking deck or garage. All facility sites are connected by an accessible path of travel that meets the ADA guidelines, the ADAG requirements. Next slide. Required number of spaces, accessible parking is required at each parking facility or site. That means garage, daily drop-off, or other surface transportation, surface parking lots. You've got a minimum number of accessible spaces as calculated per the ADA, and that is 1 in 6. So every 6th accessible parking space has to be van accessible. As you look at this link below, it says Chapter 5, parking spaces. If you click on that link, that will give you a defined number of what the spaces are required. So if you have a parking lot that only has 25 spaces or less, you have to have at least 1 van accessible space. If you've got 100 spaces, you've got to have 3 accessible spots with 1 van. If it's up to 500, you've got to have 7 with 2 vans, type of spaces. Next slide. So this is what an accessible parking space looks like. As you look at it, you see the striped access aisle. At a minimum, it has to be 48 inches wide, but preferably it's 60 inches wide, which is basically 5 feet. And then 2 adjacent parking spaces that are 8 feet wide, 96 inches, making so 2 cars can share the access aisle. At the top of the access aisle is the curb ramp to get up on the sidewalk. As you can see, the ramp cannot protrude into the access aisle. Then once you roll up to the top of it, you've got to have at least a 36-inch turning radius at the top of the aisle. That way you can go either right or left. Next slide. Accessible signage has to be there for each parking space to ensure that it's reserved for handicapped drivers. As you see, you've got a 60-inch post that that the sign has to stand on. That's a requirement. And the sign says reserved parking. It's got the International ISA sign of accessibility, which is the wheelchair user on blue background. When you need a van accessible, you've got 2 choices, which is, of course, just the blue background with the ISA and van accessible, or the normal regular reserved parking sign with the van accessible also included. Next slide. So the red brick building is our transit station. There are 3, as you can see behind it is the fixed parking garage. In front is the daily kiss and ride drop temporary parking. And then to the left is surface parking. All 3 points of parking have handicap accessible parking spaces on a direct line of path to get to the entrance of the facility. Next slide. The parking garages, you've got 2 types. At the top, you can see this parking garage is fixed to the building. You've got 3 in this diagram, you've got 3 levels. And so handicap parking needs to be at each accessible entrance. So if all 3 levels have an accessible entrance, then you can disperse your parking at all 3 levels. It's also permissible to group your van accessible parking. So normally, a lot of times that's always on the first floor. Below you see another parking garage that's not necessarily attached to the building, but serves multiple purposes for other buildings. This parking has to be on the most shortest accessible route to the accessible pedestrian entrance. And as you see by the door, you've got the accessible parking closer to the door. Next slide. So accessible route, as I just mentioned, via the parking. Accessible route must serve all accessible spaces in the element. For an exterior site, that includes a path of travel from public streets to sidewalks to transportation stops, loading zones, parking lots, through the courtyards, drinking fountains, all towards the accessible entrance. When it comes to the interior of a facility, it must serve all accessible spaces, including a path of travel to restrooms, drinking fountains, elevators, other public accommodations within the building, such as a restaurant or other professional office buildings or office suites. And then, of course, accessible routes must serve each floor within that site. So that means vertical access, which can be via elevator, ramps, or platform lifts. Next slide. So now that we have found our parking and entered the building of the transit facility, now we actually want to get on the train and go someplace. So the choices are level boarding on a subway, such as the DC Metro, which allows a person in a wheelchair basically to roll onto the train and find the designated spot that the wheelchair sits at. The gap is minimum a lot of times, and a person with a wheelchair can just bump up onto the train. Other options is light rail commuter trains, which also has level boardings, and depending on the commuter rail, it could have a deemed accessible car, which would mean the pedestrian would go to that car. If the platform is not 100% level, the train door would open and have an auto extender plate that would cover that distance or gap. The wheelchair can roll on that, as people can also exit the train walking on that platform. So when it comes to heavy rail, such as Amtrak, and they have level boarding, you would have to have a station agent or a red top to bring out a bridge plate to assist you to get on and off the train, because the gap is much wider and also higher than light rail or subway. That's what we would deem level boarding, just having a bridge plate. If there is not level boarding, you would need a platform lift, which would mean staff would come out and assist you, in that operating that lift. Once you get on the train, seating is adjacent to an accessible restroom in a designated accessible car. Next slide. So with that, I will turn it over to Danica to talk about hotels and restaurants.
Thanks to Lee for teaching us the requirements of accessible public transportation under Title II of the ADA. We'll now turn to Title III, which is public accommodations. Specifically today, we will cover hotels, restaurants, sports stadiums, and ballparks. Next slide. Title III of the ADA says that no individual on the basis of disability can be discriminated against in the equal enjoyment of goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations of any place of public accommodations owned, leased, or operated by a private entity. Places of public accommodations are things like hotels, motels, inns, restaurants, theaters, stadiums, stores, museums, golf courses, or any other place that offers goods or services to the public. In addition, public accommodations must also modify policies, practices, or procedures unless it would fundamentally alter the nature of the goods, services, facility, or accommodation. Although the ADA was passed in 1990, businesses were given time to come into compliance. In 1991, the first ADA standards of accessible design guidelines were published. The 1991 standards required new construction after January 26, 1993, or alterations after January 26, 1992 to be compliant. Then in 2010, new standards for accessible design came out, and that changed and added further guidance for accessibility requirements. These standards applied to new construction or alterations after March 15th, 2012. There is a misconception by business owners that if the building was built before the ADA, they are grandfathered in and do not have to comply with the ADA standards. However, even buildings built before the standards must still remove barriers when readily achievable. This means easily accomplishable and able to carry out without much difficulty or expense. So no building is grandfathered in just because it was built before the ADA. Today, we will be focusing on those 2010 ADA standards, but keep in mind that public accommodations built or altered pre-1991 or between 1991 and 2012 may have different requirements. Next slide. We'll now go through the ADA requirements for hotels. So we'll cover reserving a room, number of accessibility rooms required, accessibility requirements for the main entrance, the check-in desk, elevators, aspects of accessible rooms, and amenities, including gyms, pools, business centers, and conference centers. Next slide. So an accessible room must be able to be reserved in the same manner as a non-accessible room, whether this be online, over the phone, or in person. So if a hotel allows rooms to be reserved in any of these ways, accessible rooms must also be reserved in this way too. Under the ADA, the staff or website must describe those accessibility features in enough detail for someone to determine whether that room will meet their accessibility needs. Note, though, that some websites only indicate that the room is wheelchair accessible. So the hotel is not required to provide specifics such as inches about the room. But you still may ask the hotel about these, but they might not be able to immediately provide this information. They should be able to tell you, though, if the room has a roll-in shower or not. We'll talk later about the number of roll-in showers that a hotel is required to have. The hotel must also hold these accessible rooms until all other rooms of that type are reserved. For example, if there are accessible 2 bedrooms, the hotel cannot book the accessible 2 bedrooms for individuals without disabilities until all the other 2 bedrooms are reserved. Once all other 2 bedrooms are reserved, the hotel may book an accessible room for someone without disabilities. And after that accessible room is booked, the hotel does need to guarantee that the guest receives that type of room. Meaning, if you book an accessible 1 bedroom with a roll-in shower, they must give you that type of room when you arrive. Lastly, the hotel cannot charge any additional fees for accessible rooms or for service dogs. Next slide. As we've discussed, the ADA requirements did change between 1991 and 2010, and these changes also included the number of accessible rooms required. However, hotels are required to have at least 1 accessible room. This number increases depending on the overall number of rooms the hotel has. Again, it is important to note, though, that not every accessible room is required to have a roll-in shower. Only hotels with 51 or more rooms are required to have any roll-in showers at all. So a few examples: a hotel with 101 to 150 rooms must have 7 accessible rooms, but only 2 need to have a roll-in shower. For large hotels with over 500 rooms, 3% must be accessible, but only 1% must have roll-in showers. So if you need or want a roll-in shower, when you book a room, make sure to specifically ask what kind of shower or tub that room has. Since the hotel is required to save that type of room, if that room is reserved, if you are told that the room has a roll-in shower, it must have one when you arrive. Again, though, it is important to remember to ask this question if this is a specific feature that you need. Next slide. The main entrance must also be accessible. This means it needs to be connected to an accessible route from the public areas. So accessible entrances must have a doorway that is large enough or wide enough for a wheelchair and clear floor space in front of the door and maneuvering clearance. If it is an older hotel, like one that was built before the ADA, they must still remove those barriers when it is readily achievable. If it isn't, they should have an alternative accessible entrance with clear signs noting where that closest accessible entrance is. And that entrance should be as close as possible to the main entrance. In addition, the hardware, so like the door or the knob or the handle, should be easily usable. So you shouldn't have to grasp it tightly, pinch or turn in order to open the door. And it shouldn't be higher than a reachable height from the ground. So once someone has entered the hotel, the interior routes must also be wheelchair accessible. And this includes the route to the check-in desk. If you want to check the specific requirements for main entrances and doors, you can go to the Access Board's website. Next slide. So the ADA also does require cover aspects inside the hotel for the public, such as the check-in counters. The front desk must be on an accessible route from that accessible entrance and be accessible itself. So the counter specifications do depend on the year that that counter was installed, but it should be sufficiently long enough to use, whether that mean you come in at a parallel approach, meaning a wheelchair would roll up to the side of it, or a forward approach, meaning the wheelchair can roll up directly to the front of it. If it is forward approach, they should make sure that there's knee clearance and toe clearance under that counter. And staff should never treat someone with a disability differently and should make accommodations for them if needed. So let's say that accessible room reserved is on the 4th floor, then the hotel would need to have an elevator that goes from that accessible route to the floor. Next slide. So the elevator should also be accessible and useful for individuals in wheelchairs. Not only does the door need to be wide enough for a wheelchair, but it also must remain open long enough for someone to safely board and load into the elevator. It is important to note, though, that elevators are not required in all buildings. So elevators are actually not required for buildings that are only 1 to 2 stories, or if the stories are smaller. The buttons on the outside of the elevator and on the inside of the elevator should be at a reachable height. So if you are unable to reach the elevator buttons, this could mean that the elevator is inaccessible and in violation of the ADA. There are also specific requirements for the dimensions of the elevator to ensure that a wheelchair can safely fit, and all these dimensions can be found on the Access Board website. Next slide. So upon arrival to the accessible room, the room must meet very specific requirements. The ADA standards do cover a lot of aspects of accessible rooms, but there are some features that are not covered under the ADA standards. Remember, though, if you have difficulty accessing certain features of the room, contact the staff because they may be required to make modifications to the room for you. So the doorway must meet the same requirements as the main entrance as far as width and clearance, and there should always be clear floor space around it for the door to open wide enough and for an individual to maneuver through the door. There also shouldn't be a door threshold that is too high for a wheelchair to roll over it. If the thresholds are high, there should be a small ramp that the hotel installed. And the flooring is also specifically covered under the ADA. So some hotels like using very plush carpets, but these can cause issues for wheelchair wheels, which maybe get stuck in the carpet. The floor and any carpets must be stable, firm, and remain in place. Otherwise, this could cause the wheels of a wheelchair to be unable to roll, or the rug may bunch underneath the wheels. And some hotels may have lots of furniture like beds, dressers, desks, chairs, and other types of furniture. There should be sufficient space between all the furniture for a wheelchair to maneuver through the room. If you are unable to maneuver around the furniture, do contact staff who may be able to remove some of the furniture from the room. There are a lot of issues when it comes to hotel beds. So in recent years, hotels are beginning to put more plush mattresses in their room, which could cause an individual to be unable to transfer from the wheelchair to the bed. So some individuals may use a Hoyer lift to transfer onto the bed, and some hotel beds have no space underneath for the Hoyer lift. So this can cause significant issues for a person when they book an accessible room and then are unable to even use the bed. So unfortunately, the current ADA standards do not cover bed height or spacing underneath the bed. However, remember that the hotels may need to modify their room so it is accessible. If the bed can be lowered, for example, by removing box springs, ask the staff to perhaps do this for you. If there's no space underneath the bed for a Hoyer lift, the staff may be able to put the bed on blocks so they can raise it and create space. And also some states have taken this matter into their own hands by passing state laws. Maryland has recently passed a law that does have a maximum bed height and space underneath the bed for accessible rooms, and hotels are progressing to come into compliance with the law. Ohio also has a law that requires space underneath the bed, but it does not cover the maximum height of a bed. So unfortunately, though, there are very few states that have laws that cover hotel beds. So when booking a room, it may be important to ask the staff about the bed height and whether there is space underneath the bed for the use of a Hoyer lift. Beyond the furniture, controls must also be accessible by a wheelchair user. This includes the locks on the door, HVAC controls or temperature controls, blind wands or openers, and other things. These should have clear floor space around them and be within a reachable height. Again, if you're unable to reach any of the controls or a certain control, let the staff know and ask what they may be able to do to make the room more accessible. Next slide. Beyond the room itself, there are requirements and specifications for the bathroom. So this image depicts an accessible bathroom with a lower toilet, a roll-in shower, a reachable sink and soap dispenser, and a lowered mirror with clear floor space to access all parts of the bathroom. Remember, though, that not all bathrooms are required to have roll-in showers. If this is something that you need, call ahead and ask the staff about which rooms have roll-in showers. If it is a small hotel, they may have none. So the bathroom should also always have sufficient clear floor space for turning or maneuvering a wheelchair. At times, there are objects on the ground that may block this space, such as a trash can. If this is an issue you run into, then contact the staff about moving or removing the object. And there are different styles when it comes to roll-in showers, but they should always have grab bars and controls for the shower that are reachable. If the bathroom has a tub, there should also be grab bars for someone to safely transfer into the tub. The features of the bathroom should also be unobstructed and within a reachable height. This includes the towels, toilet paper dispensers, and the soap dispensers, if there is one. The height of the sink and mirror should also be low enough for an individual in a wheelchair to use. And again, there should be knee and toe clearance underneath the sink. So if you have any specific needs for a hotel room, contact the hotel ahead of time and ask about that specific feature. Next slide. So not only do the accessible rooms and check-in desk, elevators need to be on accessible routes, but so do the amenities of the hotel. This includes the gym. So though the ADA requires the gym to have equipment that is accessible for individuals in wheelchairs, meaning there should be at least one piece of equipment of each type of machine on an accessible route with clear floor space. So this means if a hotel has 3 row machines, at least one needs to be on an accessible route with clear floor space around it. If there are 4 different types of cardio equipment, one of each type of machine must be on an accessible route with clear floor space. So a hotel can't say, well, we have one type of cardio equipment with floor space, so that's all we need. If there are 4 types, one of each type of machine must be physically accessible. If the hotel has a pool or spa, this also should be on an accessible route. If it is not the main route, their closest accessible route should be clearly marked with signs. Under the current ADA standards, smaller pools and spas must have at least one accessible point of entry. So this can be done through a sloped entry or a pool lift. And large pools must actually have at least 2 accessible points of entry. And it is recommended that the 2 points be 2 different types and on different walls. But it is important to note that the older ADA standards did not cover pools. So that would be the 1991 standards. But remember, even pre-ADA pools must have those barriers removed when easily accomplishable, or accessible entries to the maximum extent feasible. This could require the hotel to install a lift in the pool or have a sloped entry. Business centers must also be on an accessible route, and the features themselves must be usable for individuals in wheelchairs. Since most business centers were installed after 2012, they should be accessible. This means a workstation should be accessible, the amenities should be reachable, the door hardware should be easy to use. And often conferences are held at large hotels. The ADA even does cover conference rooms, which should be on an accessible route and be accessible themselves. So this may require the hotel to make sure there is like enough space between tables for an individual in a wheelchair to maneuver between and provide wheelchair accessible seating. Overall, the hotel should be accessible for individuals who use wheelchairs. If you come across any aspect of a hotel that is not accessible, request staff help. There are many hotels, though, that do not comply with the ADA standards. Later in the presentation, we will talk about how to file a complaint or advocate for accessibility. Next slide. So now we will talk about the hotel restaurants and food service areas. We'll cover those paths of travel, restaurant seating, and the breakfast bars. Next slide. So this image shows a restaurant outdoor dining area with an accessible table being used by a person in a wheelchair on an accessible path to the table. As with the main entrance of the hotel, the restaurant's entrance must be on an accessible path. If it was built after the ADA, it must be accessible. If it was altered after the ADA, it must be accessible to the maximum extent feasible or have that alternative entrance with clear signs. For pre-ADA restaurants, they still must remove those barriers when readily achievable. As with the hotel, the accessible seating of a hotel of the restaurant should be an accessible route with clear floor space. And the ADA National Network does have a fact sheet that goes further into the specifications of food service areas that you can check out with the link. Next slide. So the image shows a restaurant dining area with a ramp on the left side going to an upper dining area. This is because dining areas should be accessible, excluding mezzanines, but it does include all raised or sunken areas and outdoor seating. If the restaurant was altered after the ADA, all dining rooms are not required to be accessible, but they should have an accessible area with the same services. As far as the tables themselves, 5% of those fixed tables, or at least one, if there's less than 20, must be accessible. If it's a large restaurant with multiple accessible tables, they should be spread throughout the restaurant to allow individuals to have options on where to sit. The tables should be at wheelchair height with knee clearance underneath and clear floor area for maneuvering. If you are having difficulty accessing various points of the restaurant, ask staff for assistance. And if there are areas of the dining area that are not accessible, this could be an ADA violation. Next slide. So even a lot of hotels do have self-serve breakfast bars and condiments and utensil counters. The image shows a wheelchair user accessing a condiment and utensil counter with a side reach. The counters and items should be at a sufficient height and within reach for a wheelchair user to independently access the food. The counters should be approachable either with that forward or side or parallel approach with that clear floor space. The requirements for the distance of the food does depend on whether it's an obstructed or unobstructed. And not all the condiments and utensils counters are required to be accessible, but at least half of them should. But if you are having issues accessing foods, utensils, condiments, their staff should be there to help. Now that we've covered public accommodations, specifically those hotels and restaurants, I'm going to turn it over to Susan to talk about the stadiums and ballparks.
Thanks, Danica. So this section of our presentation is going to focus on the ADA requirements at entertainment venues, because if you're going on vacation, you're likely going to think about going to a ballpark or a stadium or or a concert. And the ADA covers a host of aspects to this. And we're going to talk about buying tickets, getting into and around the stadium, seating requirements, requirements for concessions and restrooms. So on to the next slide. Well, you go to an event and you got to get a ticket. So for people with mobility impairments, that means in many cases buying a ticket for an accessible seat, hopefully next to a companion seat who is with you if you're not traveling solo. On the screen, you see a drawing of a pair of hands with a laptop and holding a credit card and likely about to buy a ticket to the game. So the ADA requires that tickets for accessible seats must be sold during the same hours through the same methods of purchase, whether that's by phone, on site, through a website, or through a third-party vendor, and during the same stages of sales as non-accessible seats. And third-party sellers must provide the same information about accessible seats as is provided about non-accessible seats using the same text and visual representations. People buying a ticket for an accessible seat can buy up to 3 additional seats for their companions in the same row, and these seats must be next to the accessible seat. The link on the slide there takes you to more details about buying tickets and what the law requires. Next slide. So in the picture, you see some happy vacationers in wheelchairs looking out over a baseball stadium. And indeed, the ADA requires all new stadiums to be accessible, so wheelchair users and their families and friends can enjoy equal access to entertainment, recreation, and leisure. This slide notes some of the requirements for stadiums, such as 1% of the seating must be wheelchair locations. if there are more than 300 seats provided, wheelchair seating has to be distributed throughout the venue. The link here takes you to a very handy short little document put together by the DOJ on the basics of what you should expect in the way of accessibility at ballparks and stadiums around the country. However, as has been noted previously, you can never have too much information and in advance. So checking with the stadium office by phone or online about its accessibility can never hurt. Next slide. We've already covered what the ADA calls for in terms of getting into and around many types of public accommodations. Like those other places, stadiums and ballparks must have accessible parking and drop-off areas, curb ramps to get you to the accessible entrances, and accessible routes around the venue. The link to the Access Board's discussion of the ADA's accessible route requirements is there on the slide for your further exploration. Next slide. So here's a photo of an infamous ADA fail, one of those frustrating experiences for sports fans who use wheelchairs when a game gets exciting and the fans in front of you stand up to watch the action, and the wheelchair user gets to look at the backsides of the spectators in front of them. The link next to the photo takes you to a very detailed guide to wheelchair spaces, companion seats, and designated aisle seats, where you can learn more about the required size of wheelchair spaces, where companion seating should be placed, designation of aisle seats, and the all-important rules governing lines of sight, which are captured in the next slide. The ADA guidelines detail how spectators in wheelchairs are to be afforded the same types of sight lines that other spectators can have during a sporting event, where spectators have sight lines over the heads of spectators that are seated in the row right in front of them. Spectators in wheelchair spaces must be afforded lines of sight over the heads of seated spectators in the first row in front of them. And where spectators are expected to stand during events, spectators in wheelchair spaces must be afforded lines of sight over the heads of those standing spectators in front of them in that row, in front of the row of wheelchair spaces. As you can see in the drawing, the person in the wheelchair is seated on a platform, allowing him or her to see over the heads of the people in front, even when those folks are standing up. So next slide. If you're looking for a hot dog and a beer at a ballpark, all concessions, including food service areas, restaurants, and souvenir stands, must be accessible. For example, lowered counters must be provided where goods are provided and where cash registers are located. Condiments and self-serve food items must also be provided within reach of a person using a wheelchair. And that link takes you to additional information about what to expect at concession counters. Next slide. So after your visit to the concession stand, it may be necessary to find a powder room. Each public and common use restroom must be accessible. This includes restrooms in work areas and restrooms located in skyboxes and suites. The drawing on this slide represents a multi-use restroom like the ones typically found in large entertainment venues and depicts at least one wheelchair accessible compartment, an accessible lavatory outside the toilet area, and an accessible urinal wherever that may be applicable. And so those are the ballpark and entertainment venues requirements. And now if one finds issues of violations or problems with compliance with the ADA, Danica is going to take it from here to tell us what to do.
Thanks, Susan. So if you do run into any physical accessibility complications with public transportation or public accommodations, there are steps you can take. So if it is a public accommodation, first you can individually advocate for physical accessibility. So contact the company or location, let them know which elements are physically inaccessible, and work with that entity to make, and you may actually be able to get these changes accomplished without going through a more formal or difficult process. If after advocacy doesn't result in changes, you may be able to file a complaint with a local office. Cities, counties, states often have ADA offices that accept complaints. Filing with a local office usually results in an investigation, and if a violation is found, the entity will be informed of that violation and the changes needed. Hopefully, this will result in the entity coming into compliance with ADA standards. And if you find physical inaccessibility with public transportation, you should file a complaint with the Department of Transportation, Office of Civil Rights. So with the link, there is a downloadable form online. You can send that mail or email, and you can also file that complaint directly online. If individual advocacy doesn't work and you want to go through a more formal process for issues with public accommodations, the hotels, restaurants, stadium, footballs, parks, the Department of Justice enforces the ADA for public accommodations, and you can file a complaint with the Civil Rights Division. And that complaint can also be filed online with a downloadable form. The form and complaint process is on the DOJ website, ada.gov. The most serious approach for ADA violations is to file a lawsuit in court. However, ADA violations do not result in any monetary gains. Some states have state laws that relate to physical inaccessibility for individuals with disabilities that can result in money being granted. But this manner of approach is the most intense and can take serious work. So we recommend that you start with individual advocacy and work from there. Next slide. So there are resources that you can use. There are 10 ADA standards throughout the country, and online you can obtain contact information for them. The Mid-Atlantic ADA Center does have lots of guidance, training, and materials on the ADA. The National Disability Rights Network, or NDRN, does have an office in each state and territory, and those are the protection and advocacy programs and client assistance programs. And these programs do assist individuals with disabilities in an array of issues. Lastly, you can go to the Paralyzed Veterans of America website at pva.org/ADA to check out resources and the issues that PVA is working on. Next slide. If you do have any questions, you can contact any of the presenters today, Lee, Susan, or myself, and our emails are up on the slide. And just let us know if you have any questions about the ADA or about inaccessibility. And I'll now turn it over to Heather for the question and answer portion.
Well, thank you to Danica, Susan, and Lee for going over various aspects of getting around when you're on that vacation, going to a city, in most cases, if you're going to a sports stadium, and using public transportation. We do have several questions that have come in, and we would like to take some time now just to try to go over some of those. So one question, which is something we do hear about frequently, related to hotel bed height. And Danica, I know you went over that a little bit in terms of what the ADA, where the ADA now stands. But can you tell us a little bit about efforts to get standards related to hotel beds under the ADA, and then also I believe the Department of Justice has weighed in on a few of these issues as well. Can you maybe just briefly tell us about that?
Yes. So as I said, right now the ADA does not have set standards for the hotel bed height or clearance underneath the bed. There are a few states that do have their own state laws, but the DOJ, the Department of Justice, is looking into this issue. It is a long-term goal of the Department of Justice. So they are looking at putting out notices of proposed rulemaking, but it is something that they are looking at. There have been a couple of court cases that have come out, and the Department of Justice has weighed in on with them, but those court cases are still pending, and there is nothing yet set in stone about those hotel bed heights or clearances.
Thanks, Danica, for giving us that update. We also had a question about the check-in counter desk height. Can you go over that again with us?
Yeah, so there are a little bit of different specification requirements if it's a parallel or forward approach, but that's just for how long the counter should be. The counter height should not be over 36 inches.
Thank you. Also sticking with hotels, we had a question about what happens when you book that room on a third-party website, one of the deal-making websites, and you're trying to get the accessible room. Who is liable for not providing the accessible room, and what can travelers do to make sure that they are going to get the accommodations that they need?
So the accessibility requirements liability does fall on the hotel. As I mentioned, there are some websites that do just put a brief description like wheelchair accessible. And the law does require them to describe the accessibility features, but that is on the hotel. So I always recommend calling that hotel first and asking if they have the accessibility features that you need. And then once again, if you do need a roll-in shower, not all accessible rooms do have a roll-in shower. So make sure when you're booking and you need a roll-in shower that you're specifically asking about that feature. And as I noted before, small hotels are not like 50 or less rooms are not required to have any roll-in showers. So this is something to keep in mind when you are planning your vacation, to call ahead, talk to the hotels, and always make sure you're planning, because it would be very unfortunate to get to a hotel and for them not to have the accessibility features that you need.
Definitely a big vacation letdown, and unfortunately something we know many PVA members have encountered. We have a question about wheelchair access into the restroom. And Lee, I'm hoping you might be able to jump in on this one. Talks about when you're trying to use the restroom and the threshold to get over to just, to make that clearance. Sometimes they have that marble threshold or something that can be really difficult to get in. How do you recommend that people, advocate when they run into those situations, particularly if it's maybe an office that they go to frequently? What can people do about that?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
The best way is personal advocacy first, which is, if there's that barrier, contact management, go to the front desk, see if you can, find out why that's there. If it's not accessible, see if there's an alternative place that you can utilize to meet your needs. And then, of course, at the end of the day, you're going to have to file a complaint to either with the public accommodation, and then eventually, with the governing body that would regulate that, maybe Department of Justice or some other entity, if that's the case.
Thanks, Lee. I have another one that I'm going to throw to you. Question, something we didn't talk about was door weight. We know that the weight of the door can make it difficult to get in or out, and including in restrooms. Any thoughts you have about the requirements for door weight, and also what people can do again if they encounter these issues.
Yeah, supposedly, you've got to have, I think it's 5 pounds or less is the requirement, a 5-pound pull. The other thing about doors is you have to have an accessible doorknob. And then, you know, especially if you're a person in a wheelchair, you know, able to physically open the door and then maneuver the wheelchair around the door. And then, of course, you need proper turning space. And depending on whether this door is like going into a hotel room, is there a width, you know, in that hall or vestibule to get in and out? There again, a lot of wheelchair users, especially like myself, who's been in a wheelchair for many years, knows how to, you know, pull the door and turn the wheelchair in a manner that you can physically accessibly maneuver that barrier. There are other aspects where some people may not. There have been times I've gotten stuck via the fact that you know, the door might be too heavy, it might close too quickly. There again, I always had to back up and try again or go and get assistance.
Thanks for that, Lee. A question we had that I'll just address really quickly was about, is the ADA working with airlines on airplane bathrooms? So because they're impossible to use for people with disabilities. And the answer to that is number one, airplanes are not covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Those are covered by a different law called the Air Carrier Access Act. And under that law, lavatories on single aisle aircraft are not currently required to be accessible for wheelchair users. That will be changing in the future. Earlier this year, the Department of Transportation did put out what we call a notice of proposed rulemaking, which was basically a new regulation that they were wanting comments on that would require in the future to have an accessible lavatory, wheelchair accessible lavatory on larger single aisle aircraft. So that is something that is in the works. It's finally recognized that it's needed. But it is going to still be a process. So stay tuned for more on that. We had a question about requirement for bed types and whether or not there is any requirements in the ADA related to that. This individual is not able to move and requires a special bed similar to a Tempur-Pedic. Danica, can you address that for us?
So the ADA does not have any standards about mattresses or bed types. So if this is something that is needed when you are on vacation or in a hotel, make sure you're calling that hotel and asking them specifically about what type of mattresses they use. And if these mattresses meet your accessibility needs. So if you do have specific features that you do need when traveling, call that hotel, contact them and make sure that you are able to get the features you need so it doesn't spoil your whole vacation.
Thanks, Danica. We had another comment about beds and rooms, and I'll take this question, but a trend that somebody noticed was single beds in wheelchair rooms. And I've heard that comment from other wheelchair users that, you know, there are those who travel with caregivers and children who might need their own bed. So why often is there only one bed in a room? And that is something that we have raised to the hotel industry, and something that we are working on some new materials around hotel access, including not just what's required under the ADA, but what we as PVA have seen as best practices, That is something that will be coming out in the next year, because we did want to identify, heard these types of complaints, and we did want to identify those to folks, that they need to understand that those who are using wheelchairs and need the accessible rooms are just like everyone else, and may have other people with them, and they may need other beds to be in that room. So thank you for raising that particular issue, because it does reinforce for us that it's something that is needed. We had a question about the sports stadiums, and we've also heard this one a lot, that there are often more able-bodied people, apparently able-bodied people sitting in the accessible seating than those that use wheelchairs. Under the law and the venue states that they can only take the person's word that they need that type of accessibility seating. And there was a question about how can this be enforced. Susan, is there any guidance you're able to give us on the sports stadium seating?
Well, I think it's possible that these folks may have hidden disabilities that enable them to purchase accessible seats in the handicap seating area. I think if there is, if you have purchased an accessible seat and someone is sitting in that seat, then you certainly have the right to raise an issue with someone at the stadium and ask to have your seat, your ticket honored.
Thanks, Susan. We are at time. I will note that if you have a question that didn't get answered, we will follow up with you offline. There was a question, which I think is a good final parting comment, about the issues of drive-by lawsuits and folks that maybe aren't looking for accessibility, but looking to try to get a settlement out of filing some type of lawsuit. You know, that unfortunately is still an issue. It is still something that is occurring in some places. The states that tend to have laws that provide more remedies, meaning usually that there's financial compensation that you can get if you're, found to be in violation, tend to be states that have more of these types of lawsuits. Right now, it's not clear that, if Congress is going to weigh in, we're not anticipating seeing anything the rest of this year, but in the last couple of Congresses, there has been legislation that would address, try to address the issue of lawsuits through what we call notification. So the person having to give a notification of a barrier prior to being able to file a lawsuit. I would say at the moment that's all still in flux, and that it's it's something that we are anticipating is still an issue, but we are also working on other matters, including trying to just help businesses have more resources so that they can become accessible, because we do know that there are so many accessibility issues that people do continue to face every day. So I do want to thank you for taking time to be with us today. Again, if you did not get your question answered, don't hesitate to reach out to any of the folks that presented today, Danica, Lee, or Susan, and they would be happy to follow up with you and give you additional information. With that, we thank you for your time with us today, and glad that you joined us to celebrate the 32nd anniversary of the ADA, and we look forward to seeing you on one of our future webinars. Thank you.